The sun was slowly rising over the small town in Oklahoma. Chris Riley got out of bed, opened the window, and inhaled the fresh morning air. He smiled and silently thanked God for everything he had in his life. Chris had been working as a leader in a small house of God for about 10 years. Not a day passed without him helping someone from congregation to regain faith in themselves and the Almighty. At the time, Chris never insisted or forced people to believe in what didn't feel right to them. Looking at the leader, the locals often said that Chris would do well to become a missionary and go to some God-forsaken country to spread faith among those eager to join the flock. Few people knew that just a decade ago, Chris couldn't even think of becoming a leader. And he had a very good reason for this. The thing was that after finishing high school, Chris was admitted to the Boston University of Medicine, where he intended to get a degree in surgery. Many of his teachers would probably be surprised to see one of their best graduates wearing the robe of a leader. Back then, Chris's life seemed so stable and predictable that he was sure he knew what to expect for years to come. First, he completed his residency, then got a job in the surgical department, and then started treating people. Over time, Chris didn't just gain respect for his patients, but also started earning good money, which gave him financial independence. Basking in his glory, Chris was happy to have everything a man his age could ever dream of. Unfortunately, fate had its own plans for the young surgeon, and Chris had no idea what fateful turns awaited him in the future. It all started with a bleeding young man who ended up on Chris's operating table. According to the nurse on call, the man had just been in a terrible road accident and was now balancing on the edge of life and death. If the hospital had been a little further from the scene of the tragedy, the man would have died without even reaching the surgeon's table. The young biker got a chance thanks to the kind people that witnessed the tragedy and literally carried him to the hospital. Since the young man's artery was damaged, his condition remained critical. Chris was very fast, even though he understood that he probably wouldn't be able to save the unfortunate man. It was the first time that anyone had died on Chris's operating table. Before then, Chris managed to pull even the most critical patients back from the brink. But this patient became the young surgeon's sentence. After the patient's heart stopped beating, Chris grabbed his head and fell to his knees in front of him. The chief of surgery had no issues with the young surgeon's performance. He even warned Chris of the most likely outcome. Well, what was I supposed to do? Just let him die without even trying to save him? Chris argued his point, raising his voice. During the trial, the hospital management supported the young surgeon. Chris was acquitted since no criminal negligence was found in his actions. He did everything he could in this complex situation. But even though the judge acquitted Chris, the surgeon had long ago sentenced himself to a very harsh punishment in his mind. Ever since that patient, whenever Chris picked up a scalpel or a clamp, his hands started hurting and his fingers became cottony and weak. The incident with the young biker undermined Chris's confidence, and the young surgeon stopped enjoying his work. Having lost faith in himself, the man started drinking and eventually resigned from the hospital. Since then, Chris hadn't held a scalpel in his hands for over 10 years, and whenever he saw people in white coats, he couldn't help but start feeling very anxious. Chris was repeatedly offered to come back to his job at the hospital, but the man just shook his head in refusal and kept saying that his time serving medicine was long over. It seemed that Chris's life was steadily going downhill, but the reality turned out to be quite different. One day, Chris woke up hungover in the city cemetery. He looked at a religious symbol a few yards away and felt the desire to ask God for help. That was the last day Chris drank alcohol. A while later, he entered a seminary, graduated with honors, and was ordained. Having moved to a small town in southern Oklahoma, Chris began to serve the local residents as a mediator in their communication with God. He lived in a small house a quarter-mile from the house of God. Of course, this was nothing like the penthouse he had as a surgeon in Boston. But Chris had permanently erased that part of his life from his mind and intended to dedicate himself to serving God. The locals greatly appreciated Chris, always coming to him for service, knowing that he would never refuse to help them. Some felt an irresistible urge to come in for a confession, while others were making their first timid steps in search of faith. Chris always knew what to say. He always had just the right advice for everyone. That day wasn't any different. A black funeral hearse with a massive lacquered coffin inside drove to the house of God. It looks like they've brought someone for a funeral service. Chris whispered to himself and started getting dressed. Dressed in his robe, he left the house and quickly walked to the church. A minute later, the leader noticed the license plate on the hearse were from a different state. That's strange. Why would they come here from another state? It doesn't matter, of course. My services are available to anyone who needs them, but why would someone choose to make such a long journey? Chris wondered. It turned out that the deceased was a young man who died of a heart attack. Not that Chris had never encountered anything similar in his career. Human nature still hides many mysteries, so one can never know where death might await them. However, the young man lying in the coffin didn't look dead at all. The skin of the deceased was pink and smooth, and his face radiated calmness and serenity, as if he wasn't dead, but simply deeply asleep, traveling through the world of Morpheus. Only 3 people came to send the young man off on his journey: his young wife and 2 men that stood a bit further away. While the young woman's face was unfamiliar to Chris, he immediately recognized one of the men as an orderly who worked at the local morgue. His name was Vince Lambert. Because of his line of work, Chris had heard a lot about him, and it was all bad. But since Chris didn't know Vince personally, he couldn't pass any judgment based on the rumors alone. But now, Chris had the chance to meet Vince Lambert in person. He was an unpleasant man in his 40s with a puffy, perpetually pale face and shifty eyes. Rumor had it that Vince liked gambling and had a drinking problem, which nullified all of his attempts to get rich. The only thing that worked to the orderly's advantage was his innate caution and truly fox-like cunning, which helped him carry out all kinds of schemes within the walls of the morgue. I wonder what brought him to the house of God today, Chris thought with surprise. The coffin had already been placed on the pedestal so the priest could conduct the service, after which the hearse would take it to the local cemetery. There, a burial place had already been prepared for the deceased. The first thing that made Chris suspicious was the strange haste in conducting the funeral. It turned out that the young man had died the night before, but the next day, he was already brought several hundreds of miles to be buried far from his home. On the other hand, Chris didn't want to ask too many questions. After all, he was a leader, not one of those private detectives who always see criminals in everyone they meet. The young man probably had relatives in the city, which could be the reason why they decided to bury him at the local cemetery. Chris called over his assistant and explained what he needed to do and which attributes he needed to bring over for the funeral service. Then Chris walked around the coffin and approached it from the other side. That's when he noticed that one of the buttons on the man's shirt was undone. Apparently, the coroner in the morgue was in such a hurry that he failed to properly prepare the body. Since Chris was never afraid of the sight of death, he tried to button up the shirt himself. But what the leader saw under the young man's shirt made him shudder. The former surgeon was very surprised to see that there was no characteristic autopsy incision on the deceased man's stomach. That was the first time Chris had seen anything like this. As a former medic, he knew that autopsies were required in almost all cases of death. So what had happened in this situation? Why were they in such a hurry to bury this young man who looked very much alive? "Excuse me, can we move this along? I can't bear to stand here and look at him any longer." The deceased man's wife stammered through tears. Chris looked at her in surprise and with some inexplicable sixth sense, felt that her tears had nothing to do with grief or sorrow. Chris's suspicions were further aroused when he noticed movement in the chest area of the deceased. Truthfully, Chris didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, knowing that no prayer could bring someone from the afterlife to the world of the living. But what he saw just then fundamentally changed his attitude towards life. The chest of the deceased man quietly rose and fell with his regular breathing. As a former surgeon, Chris always paid attention to such details, and so he knew that the young man lying before him was clearly very much alive. Having touched the hand of the deceased, Chris immediately felt the warmth of his skin. Since the pulse was almost imperceptible, the priest approached the grieving woman and asked for a small mirror from her makeup bag. "What? A mirror? What do you need it for?" the young widow asked, stammering at every word. But Chris had no time or desire to explain. Having gotten the mirror from the man's wife, the leader held it under the deceased man's nose and saw the characteristic condensation, which immediately covered the mirror's reflective surface. At that moment, Chris understood everything. The leader looked at the morgue orderly, Vince, and saw that he was slowly backing away, looking frightened. "Call the police immediately and the ambulance, now!" Chris told his assistant sharply and started giving the young man CPR. Vince Lambert immediately tried to flee, but was soon caught by one of the house officers, who skillfully trapped him up in time. A few minutes later, a police car and an ambulance pulled up to the house of God. But this time, the young man had regained consciousness, although he still felt very weak. Having realized that her plan was uncovered, the young woman tried to flee, but she didn't get far and was caught by the police half a mile from the house of God. Having covered her face with her hands, she began to scream that it was her brother, Vince Lambert, who came up with the plan and convinced his sister to do it. As the investigation found out, the man who woke up in the coffin was a wealthy heir whose father had left him their family business and a substantial amount of money a few years ago. 6 months later, Patrick Holmes met Jessica, who did everything to lure the young wealthy man into marriage. Most likely, if her brother Vince hadn't come up with that plan, she would never have dared to do something like that. But since Vince worked at the morgue, he managed to make sure that no one conducted the autopsy on the young man, who was simply out on strong sleeping pills. After Vince's capture, his accomplices from the morgue were also exposed and faced severe punishment. After all that had happened, Chris and Patrick became good friends. Now, the young businessman started coming to Chris's worship center every Sunday, after which he took leave with an enlightened, slightly detached look on his face. Patrick started spending most of his wealth on charity, having open shelters for people experiencing homelessness and animals. He also decided to renovate the old house of God that gave refuge to a leader named Chris. As for the local residents, their belief in God only grew stronger, and they believed it was God who used the local leader to save the young man. After all, if you sincerely believe in something, all of the obstacles in your life can be overcome in a very, very short time.